Hello, I am Jack Llewellyn, and in 2022, I wrote a book. It's called Someone Had to Die. Someone Had to Die is a creative nonfiction, which means it tells a true story but uses a fictional narrative to do so. And it deals with the 1985 kidnapping, interrogation, torture, and murder of DEA Special Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in Guadalajara, Mexico. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of a little bit about the case, and then talk about my involvement in the case, things that happened after my involvement in the case that led me to write Someone Had to Die, and point out some of the unique features about the book that I think make it incredibly interesting for anyone who is interested in the case or about Mexican cartels in general, or frankly, just somebody who's interested in a murder mystery. So, our story starts in late 1984 in Guadalajara, Mexico. In Guadalajara at the time, there was a small DEA office. And at any given time, there were about 4 agents in the office. I always say that during this time, it was a little bit like the Wild Wild West for these agents. They weren't allowed to carry guns. They weren't allowed to arrest people. They were charged with finding information and then passing it on to Mexican authorities. And in most respects, were really beholden to local, state, and federal law enforcement officials and officers who, many of whom at least, had been corrupted and were working for the drug traffickers at that time. Nevertheless, the DEA did a phenomenal job of finding, in particular, vast quantities of marijuana that were grown by some of the drug traffickers located in Guadalajara. In early November 1984, they found the biggest one. And it was a ranch called Rancho Buffalo in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. And it was a huge plantation, the biggest marijuana plantation ever found. Enormous, billions of dollars worth of marijuana, 7,000 employees. It was just enormous. And it was raided by the Mexican military based on some information provided by the DEA. Interestingly, none of that information, or virtually none of it, came from the DEA office in Guadalajara, but the drug traffickers affected were primarily in Guadalajara. And at this time, there were really 3 major drug traffickers. Later on, they get called the Guadalajara Narcotics Cartel, but they weren't a cartel at the time. There was nothing like that, but there were 3 predominant ones. There was a man by the name of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, also known as El Padrino, the Godfather. Felix Gallardo's real role was on the cocaine side of the business, and he's the one largely responsible for providing transportation and distribution routes to allow vast quantities of Colombian cocaine to move from South America through Mexico into the United States. There also was Ernesto Fonseca, Don Neto, who was someone who'd been around for a long time. Who had been in the trade for 20 years or so. And then there was kind of the young gun, a kid by the name of Rafael Caro Quintero, who was responsible for a lot of these large marijuana fields. And those were the 3 main players at the time. So you have this enormous raid on Rancho Buffalo in 1984. You have some other events, but really we'll then fast forward to February 7, 1985 at about 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And about that time, Kiki Camarena was sitting in his office at the American consulate in Guadalajara, and he all of a sudden says, "Oh, crap, I'm late. I'm supposed to meet my wife for lunch," and he races out of the American consulate and is never seen alive again. By all accounts and evidence, it appears that on his way to his truck, which was located catty corner across from the American consulate, he was abducted by 3 or 4 individuals, including at least one who probably had DFS, a federal security agency, credentials, and was placed in a small Volkswagen Atlantic and taken to a home in Guadalajara located at 881 Lope de Vega. Even today, if you go from the consulate to Lope de Vega, that's what it's commonly referred to, 881 Lope de Vega, it's about 8 minutes. So he was taken there, and for the next day or two, he was brutally tortured, interrogated. Those interrogations were taped in whole or in part. And at some point during that interrogation and torture, he succumbed to his injuries and died. So that's the factual background. Move you ahead to May of 1990, and a second-year law student from the University of Minnesota is a summer associate at a large firm on the west side of Los Angeles. That person would be me. And I get the great fortune of being assigned to do a little bit of research on a criminal case in the office. Little did I know. So the criminal case that I started to do some research on and then started working more extensively on was the defense of a gentleman by the name of Ruben Zuno-Arce. Now, Ruben Zuno-Arce comes from a very prominent family in Guadalajara, and he was the president, or the brother-in-law, of the former president of Mexico, Luis Echeverria. Mr. Zuno was accused, along with others, of having been involved in a conspiracy to commit crimes against Agent Camarena, and he was on trial in federal district court in Los Angeles. And I started working on that case fairly extensively for the rest of the summer, including going to many of the trial proceedings. Mr. Zuno was found guilty in that trial. There was a new trial order as a result of prosecutorial misconduct in closing arguments. That new trial order was later affirmed by the Ninth Circuit, and in 1992, when I was back as a regular associate in this law firm in Los Angeles, Mr. Zuno went to trial again and was again convicted. The closing arguments in that case were on December 16th, 1992. And at that time, the lead partner in the case, my mentor, a gentleman by the name of Ed Medvine, told me that I just worked on the most exciting case of my legal career. Keep in mind, at that point, I'd been a lawyer for a year, but he was right. As a little bit of background for Mr. Zuno, the house at 881 Lope de Vega was owned by Rafael Caro Quintero, but it had been previously owned by Mr. Zuno. And so the allegations were in part that Mr. Zuno was part of the trafficking group, that he participated in the planning of the kidnapping and interrogation of Agent Camarena, and that the transaction transferring the house from him to Caro Quintero was a sham transaction. So as I say, 1992, Mr. Zuno is convicted again. I worked for the next 5 years or so on appeals. I also worked in the 1990s with a few other indicted and unindicted people who were compiling evidence and things relating to the case. And then for about 20 years, I carried with me boxes of Zuno and Camarena-related materials, and kept saying, one of these days I'm going to look at some of these things more. Would wax poetically to people, usually over adult beverages, about how it was unfair. Mr. Zuno received, a life sentence in federal penitentiaries for something he didn't do, etc., etc. Move us up to 2018, and Netflix puts out the series Narcos Mexico. And I started watching it. And let me say, Narcos Mexico never proclaims to be a documentary, and it's really well done. Okay? But it's not true. Lots and lots and lots of things that I personally didn't think were accurate. Some things, such as Agent Camarena's involvement in that Rancho Buffalo, are completely wrong. But nevertheless, my creative juices, my mind starts going after this, especially by about the third season. And I start pulling out my boxes. I start looking at things. I start thinking about things and organizing materials. And then we get to 2020. Late July, I think, of 2020, and Amazon Prime puts out The Last Narc, which is a purported documentary, a 4-part documentary, starring former DEA agent, former head of Operation Lambda, the task force in the DEA charged with investigating the Camarena case, Hector Berrellez, who comes out and says, amongst other things, the reason that Camarena was killed was because he had stumbled upon activities of the CIA, that the CIA was central in the efforts to pick him up and interrogate him, that certain DEA agents working with Camarena were on the take and were working for the drug traffickers. And The Last Narc purports to present 3 witnesses to many of the operative events, that being Jorge Godoy, Rene Lopez Romero, and Ramon Lira. And I watched this 4-part series. I can't even call it a docu-series. And frankly, I was appalled because I didn't believe most of it. Shortly after that, I got in touch with a few former DEA agents and decided to investigate more. And I pulled all the documents that I had. I pulled documents that others had. I compiled as many documents as I could. And I came to the conclusion that for me, The Last Narc was not accurate, that Agent Camarena's story was being bastardized for somebody else's benefit, and that there was a real story to be told out there. And the result of that story is someone had to die. In preparing Someone Had to Die, as I say, I am fairly confident that I compiled, went through, and looked at more Camarena trial. So, from 1990 forward, more documents than any other party has, with the possible exception of the DEA. I spoke with former DEA agents. I spoke with people who worked with Agent Camarena. I spoke with drug traffickers who may or may not have been at Lope de Vega on February 7 and February 8, 1985, but who knew Rafael Caro Quintero. I spoke with drug traffickers who worked with Felix Gallardo. So I did as much due diligence as I could. As I say, I came to very different conclusions than is presented in The Last Narc, that is represented by Agent Berrellez, and I put that into Someone Had to Die. Concurrently, I compiled a website, and all of the documents, all of the facts that form the basis for Someone Had to Die can be found there, publicly accessible. I also then started working on a podcast called Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena, where, amongst other things, we broke down the specific allegations made in the Last Narc, and we debated them. We presented evidence, specific evidence, to refute many of the claims of Godoy and Lopez Romero and Lira and Hector Berrellez. And we put those out. We're on episode 37 or so. And now we're going to continue that on the YouTube channel. In addition to talking about the Camarena case, we talk a lot about Mexican cartels. We trace the events that happened after Agent Camarena's abduction and murder and how they directly affect what's going on in Mexico right now. And we're going to look at the current cartels in Mexico, their impact on the U.S., and otherwise continue to explore the Camarena case, the conspiracies and the allegations surrounding that case, and Mexican cartels today. So that's where we're going to go. I appreciate you joining me for the first one, and we will see you soon for another episode of Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena.